Percy Jackson, the greatest character in fiction, almost solos Jujutsu Kaisen, and in this video I'll be explaining exactly why that's the case. Now, in versus battle matchups like these, I typically don't waste any time introducing the presented characters or series, but considering that I usually don't cover anime and manga exclusively, I figured that a basic rundown of who Percy Jackson is would be appropriate. For all intents and purposes, Percy Jackson is the title character of his own book series that exists in a universe in which Greek mythology and the mythology of multiple other parts of the world are real and influential in the present day. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and many other Greek deities are active in the everyday lives of mortals and oftentimes foster children with them. These children are known as demigods or half-bloods, literally being half mortal and half god. Percy is one of these half-bloods and a particularly strong one. Being the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea, Percy has a myriad of water-based abilities as you would expect. Throughout the many books that he exists in, Percy demonstrates the ability to manipulate water in very destructive ways to overpower his opponent with extremely potent force. Tidal waves, limbs constructed from water, and even a self-contained hurricane are all things that Percy can do with his control over the substance if he so chooses. And if you happen to be fighting the demigod near a large body of water, his connection to it and his godly heritage only grows stronger, allowing him to pull even greater levels of power from the depths. Now, on top of the Poseidon-specific powers that are granted to him, Percy has a myriad of minor hacks or resistance feats that are going to prove extremely important for him in a prolonged battle against Jujutsu Kaisen characters as I have placed him in. Particularly, Percy's resistance to extreme temperatures, as demonstrated by his ability to survive multiple bolts of lightning and lava directly making contact with the skin, his ability to manipulate poison as a byproduct of the water that can be found within it, his regenerative abilities when in contact with a body of water, his resistance to multiple forms of high-level magic, and even his ability to resist the imbued effect of a specific blade called Backbiter, which is stated to be able to rip the soul from the body upon making a cut. All of these abilities and more are just some of the minor hacks that Percy has demonstrated he is resistant to or is able to counter with. On top of all of this, when at the peak of his powers physically, Percy also has access to the Curse of Achilles, which gives him complete physical invulnerability with the exception of one spot on his back that is extremely susceptible to harm. Percy has multiple other minor abilities that are granted to him through his heritage, but I'll address those more context-specific powers when I actually discuss how I think he interacts with the Jujutsu Kaisen universe as a whole. For the time being, I've adequately covered Percy's basic hacks, which leads us to the oh so important question. How strong is this guy really? See, if you're like me and have been a big fan of the Percy Jackson books for a while, you may underestimate how strong this guy actually is when removed from his own universe. In the context of the overarching Riordan verse, Percy's a pretty scary guy, giving the god of war Ares a tough time at the age of 12, holding the weight of the sky on his shoulders for a brief time at 13, going blow for blow with the Titan of Time at 15, and walking through hell squared, all without succumbing to the ancient powers that be. However, how this exactly translates to battles across fiction is a bit more tricky, and it required me to go digging in my old books to look for specific feats or statements regarding his physical abilities, and to my surprise, I found quite a few that led me to the conclusion that he could step to JJK and instantly be granted top tier status. For example, in the fourth book of the original series, Battle of the Labyrinth, Percy's essentially able to self-detonate and cause the eruption of a volcano single-handedly, Mount St. Helens to be specific. The amount of force required to do something like this is around 24 megatons of TNT, or enough power to level a city with the force of the blast. Now, this level of output from Percy is impressive in its own right, but even when ignoring just how destructive he could be here, there are three extremely important things to note in this specific feat. The first is that Percy isn't intentionally trying to cause this much destruction in this instance. We know this because he actively says so himself when it's revealed just how much damage and destruction he actually caused. In fact, it's even made clear that he didn't know he could do this. The lack of intent on Percy's part simply makes what he did that much more impressive. The second thing to note is that this feat directly correlates to his durability as a baseline, because he himself is the one who caused the explosion in the heart of the volcano and was subsequently launched from the blast as a result of it. By the very nature of this feat, Percy has to scale to his output here. And the third and final thing that is oh so impressive about Percy blowing up a volcano is the fact that this doesn't even come close to the limits of his capabilities. Not only is Percy just 14 in the Battle of the Labyrinth, but as the books progress and the danger that he faces grows more and more threatening, he continues to rise to the occasion and match them blow for blow. Take his brief encounter with the King of Giants, for example, where even while weakened, he's able to knock the giant down and show force that is relative to him numerous times during their battle. This is so impressive because not only has this giant been stated to be able to lift mountains, but other weaker giants that Percy had also faced have been stated to be able to lift mountains with such ease that stacking them on top of each other in order to reach Mount Olympus was seen as a dumb but not impossible plan for them. Now, this isn't to say that Percy has the ability to literally backpack a mountain in its entirety, rather that when in the context of combat and bursts of physical might, he's able to contend with significantly larger opponents with overwhelming physical power. This is a pretty consistent level of scaling for top tier demigods as well, as we see other big three children like Nico and Jason perform feats on this level. Even if you think that Percy isn't far and away the most powerful demigod of the main cast, which many characters in the story say or imply that he is, he does have multiple encounters with them that demonstrate that he's at least relative, which is important especially when talking about Jason Grace, who is able to summon a storm of great magnitude with such speed that the feat is actually calculated to be island level in terms of the required power to do such a thing. If we're trying to scale Percy's destructive capacity and all-around attacking power in the most consistent and logically sound way possible, this is about where he would end up. The mountain to island level range is demonstrated extremely consistently through a myriad of feats and statements, all of which the protagonist of peak fiction the series scales to. However, if you were to highball Percy and many of the other powerful demigods that he fights alongside in Heroes of Olympus, you'd be able to argue that the true extent of his power lies more closely to large country level. This is due to Percy showing relativity to giants on numerous occasions throughout the story, and giants are considered the superior children of Gaia when compared to the Titans. Many of the most powerful Titans in the story have feats relative to or even greater than the Greek gods themselves, who at the highest levels can casually vaporize entire seas, demolish islands accidentally, or just casually set their divine weapons to nuke mode. Now, as impressive as this would be, I do say that it's a highball for Percy just due to how consistently the gods of the Riordanverse are shown to be leagues above the demigod offspring that they have when it comes to pure power. Percy's shown that he can tangle with gods like Ares while they aren't using the full extent of their abilities, but when entering their divine forms, it's clear that even the strongest of half-bloods can't really compete. The potential scaling is there, especially when thinking back to the fact that Percy pinned Hades down in his own domain and made him run away, but it simply isn't as accordant with the rest of the book series as everything else to say that Percy can literally nuke or vaporize seas in an instant. Still, this gives us a decent range of power that he'll be wielding when going up against the Jujutsu Kaisen universe, and when paired with his extremely impressive speed, I think you'll see why I have such confidence in Percy when throwing him up against an entire world. For his speed scaling, it honestly requires much less explanation than his strength did. In the Titan's Curse, he was able to perceive and deflect a bullet and does something similar against an army of underworld soldiers in the Last Olympian. Going one step beyond this later in the series, we see that on multiple occasions, either Percy or characters that he is shown to be a match for are able to react to lightning bolts outright. This level of speed isn't an outlier either, and actually happens rather frequently in the story. Jason reacts to lightning, giants that Percy fights are able to react to lightning, and even he has deflected a bolt of the stuff off his blade when fighting the son of Jupiter himself. On its own, this would already mean that Percy outscales 99% of the Jujutsu Kaisen universe, but after searching for any feats that I may have missed, I discovered that in the Last Olympian, Percy literally reacts to the light of Hyperion from a short distance, placing him at least relativistic speeds. So, in case all of that just sounded like a bunch of mumbo jumbo to you, you can essentially look at Percy as a physical monster. Now we'll talk about how his fighting style, experience, hack, strength, speed, and durability all play a part in more detail once I get to breaking down how this matchup shakes out. But before we do that, let's quickly go over Jujutsu Kaisen and its scaling. If you've been here before and seen my cross-verse power scaling content, I'm sure you've heard me go on this spiel in the past, but for all those unfamiliar with the series and its scaling, or those who just need a refresher, let's go over how strong the Jujutsu Kaisen verse is as succinctly as possible. The important thing to note with this story is that there are about 3 tiers that you can scale the entire verse to, and they escalate both in impressiveness and leaps in logic. Tier 1 is the most reserved and downplayed when it comes to stats. At this stage, we're relying purely on destructive feats and calcs that result from it, as well as statements from the narrator or author himself, and when we do so, the Jujutsu Kaisen universe caps out around city level and vaguely faster than Mach 1. The AP scaling relies rather heavily on massive feats of destruction like Sukuna's Fire Arrow, Jogo's Maximum Meteor, and Gojo's Unlimited Hollow Purple to give us the level at which these characters are operating at. The speed comes from Naoya's Mach 3 statement, and top tier characters in the series most likely being above this. It is difficult to determine and pin down to what extent they surpass this level of speed, simply because at this point we haven't gotten a direct comparison or updated statement. Now, I view this first tier as the safest option when scaling the series, simply because it relies on the least assumptions and most fundamental things shown to us in the story. But with that being said, I also think that it's it's a low ball for what the verse in actuality scales to, and that is where the next level comes in. Tier 2 is the level directly above this, and it's what I consider to be the most middling way to scale Jujutsu Kaisen. While it does rely on a few more assumptions and generosities to come to this conclusion, they aren't so wild or unfounded in their premise that I deem it unfit to use matchups like this, and when following this line of thinking, the upper echelons are able to reach island levels of attack potency and be significantly faster than the speed of sound. For the attack potency scaling, that relies entirely on domain expansions and how they are explained within the story. Put simply, the inside of a domain is constructed through a character's cursed energy and curse technique, and while the outside of the domain and inside are incongruent, the actual environment crafted within the barrier actually exists. Now, in saying all of that, I realize that I didn't put that simply at all, so I'll say it like this. Because Jogo and Dagon are able to create a mountain and island within their domain expansions respectively, their cursed energy output and composition should scale to these things, placing every character that's stronger than them even higher on the totem pole. For the speed scaling, you need only rely on calculations based on known speed quantities to get the verse a couple of dozen times faster than sound. Maki catching a bullet, Yuji blocking piercing blood from close range, Kenjaku dodging it at the last second, and Sukuna essentially blitzing the attack, all essentially demonstrate that these JJK characters can reach hypersonic to hypersonic plus levels of speed if they need to. This is all well and good, but there's one level higher that we can go, the final tier of scaling that even remotely makes sense for where the series is at right now. Tier 3 is this level, and while I would consider most of the speed and strength scaling presented here inconsistent or at least an extreme highball, the arguments do exist, so I'll lay them out for you to parse. At the tippity top of tier 3, Gojo, Sukuna, and Yuki all stand, and they would all, through some roundabout means, have planetary destructive attack potency in one way or another. This conclusion comes from a few separate statements or showings in the manga, but primarily Yuki's black hole feat, the volume covers for the series stating that Sukuna's full power could destroy the world, and Sukuna's ability to, quote, cut the world itself are all the pieces of information that lead me to this conclusion. The latter two abilities and statements would apply exclusively to Sukuna due to him being the strongest in the series right now, which means that we have to focus on Yuki here to get any other character to this planetary level of scaling. It's undeniable that as a special grade sorcerer, she was able to produce an ability that threatened to destroy the world, but the important context is that it required Yuki sacrificing her own life to achieve this level of destructive ability. Much like Mei and her crows, Yuki likely was able to dramatically increase her own cursed energy output through sacrificing her life. Now this does mean that comparable or superior sorcerers like Gojo, Yuta, and Kenjaku might be able to accomplish a similar feat under similar circumstances so long as they're willing to die to do so. Speed-wise, at this tier you can argue that a large part of the cast are lightning timers, with Sukuna and Gojo alone having light speed physical scaling. When fighting against Kashimo, Hikari is shown to be capable of reacting to lightning and even dodging it throughout their battle. Now I've seen a lot of contention regarding this feat due to a multitude of reasons, primarily because of how ambiguous the instance of Hikari's avoidance really is, plus the contradiction of the Naoya statement later on in the story. In the context of Hikari's avoidance of lightning right here, it's certainly possible and even feasible to argue that he isn't actually dodging it. However, later on in the fight, he is capable of ejecting the cursed energy that comprises the attack before it blows up his brain, demonstrating more concretely the possibility for JJK characters to perceive and actually deal with lightning level attacks once you get to a certain level. To address the whole Naoya Mach 3 contradiction, I mean, Gege kinda just did a weird thing in regards to this statement, because we have a myriad of other feats or statements alike that would place both human Naoya and current Maki multiple times above that level of speed. So it's clear that there is some dissonance between what's shown and what's said about these characters' speed level. For the light speed scaling exclusive to the strongest, that comes from Sukuna, quote unquote, dodging Kashimo's attacks, which are constituted of electromagnetic waves. Gojo was shown to be at least relative to the version of Sukuna who did this speed-wise, so he should scale as well. Now, the reason this interpretation of JJK characters, even exclusively the strongest, is a bit iffy is because we don't know whether or not Sukuna is dodging Kashimo's aim in this moment or actually avoiding the attack after it's already been launched. Regardless, as I already made clear, this level of scaling is meant to be more of a highballed or exaggerated point of contention for them, so we'll leave it as it is. And with that, we have the 3 core tiers of Jujutsu Kaisen physical scaling. Typically, I take this time to get into the hacks and abilities of the entire Jujutsu Kaisen universe, but I'll address them as I find them necessary, allowing us to jump directly into how I think this battle shakes out. Now, when it comes to Percy matching up against the Jujutsu Jujutsu Kaisen universe, a few things make themselves pretty evident. The first is that the Son of Poseidon at nearly every level of scaling outclasses the vast majority of JJK characters. Percy, unlike most of the people that he's facing today, has reacted to, blocked, or outright dodged lightning on numerous occasions without any room for ambiguity or contradiction, making it the lowest that you can place his character in the speed department. Conversely, a large majority of the verse views attacks like Piercing Blood as particularly fast, despite it only achieving a velocity that is vaguely above Mach 1. Naoya with Projection Sorcery needs to spam his technique to hit subsonic levels of speed, and even when significantly amped through becoming a curse, hitting Mach 3 is viewed as impressive, at least when talking about most of JJK. Hikari has his lightning avoidance feats for sure, but even those don't compare as well to Percy literally deflecting bolts of lightning off his sword or facing off against characters who can do so on a pretty regular basis. Highballing his speed a bit and comparing it to the JJK highball shows us that even then, Percy still outscales everyone in the series barring Gojo and Sukuna respectively, as his reaction to light vastly supersedes any massively hypersonic scaling you can apply to everyone not named Gojo Satoru or Ryomen Sukuna. In simple terms, this means that in a one-on-one confrontation, Percy is avoiding almost every single attack that these characters throw at him, and even when being jumped, Sukuna's recent performance has made it clear that overwhelming speed and potency will allow for a total decimation of high-tier opponents simultaneously. This gets worse when you realize that Percy can clash with characters who view stacking mountains as a feasible strategy to get to Mount Olympus, and Jason, who's able to spawn a storm capable of trapping Gaia in an instant. These two demigods have been compared on numerous occasions, and so have their storms, which puts Percy's attack potency into perspective quite a bit. If you use consistent JJK scaling, this means high tiers within the story are able to compete via their hacks and curse techniques, but physically speaking, even Sukuna and Gojo haven't shown anything to imply that their basic punches and kicks should have the same bite as Percy's slashes and miniature hurricanes. Pair this ridiculous strength with his overwhelming speed, and every character who doesn't have a particularly difficult curse technique to parse gets dealt with rather quickly. In the event that you really want to lean into the more wacky and inconsistent forms of scaling for Percy and his opponents, his large country levels of strength and durability mean that there are less than a handful of characters that could survive a single clash with him, much less actually do damage to the demigod. I already established that Yuki, Gojo, and potentially other special grade sorcerers could surpass his durability if they were willing to sacrifice themselves on the planet along with them, leaving Sukuna as the only character who you can even argue has the capacity to damage Percy in a normal, non-suicidal encounter. Taking these facts into consideration leads to a rather basic conclusion. If you aren't considered godlike in the verse due to your technique or physical abilities, Percy will be slicing through you like butter. Even if the Jujutsu Kaisen skill gets activated and they all attempt to dogpile him, I'm still betting quite a bit of money on Percy prevailing. This stance is even more substantiated when you consider that Percy has a lot of familiarity dealing with armies of opponents who aren't as strong, fast, or skilled as him in combat. Anybody below the level of special grade is getting blitzed and cut through with Riptide, and it's honestly not even a particularly close fight. Domain expansions from lower level characters could be a problem if they weren't getting blitzed into oblivion, and this means that only the cream of the crop physically, or those who have techniques that Percy wouldn't be able to get through with ease, are getting handled. Disaster class curse spirits like Hanami, Dagon, and Jogo wouldn't be able to finish Percy off even if they did land their domain expansions either. We've already seen a younger, weaker, less experienced Percy cause the eruption of a volcano and survive being at its epicenter, so Jogo's coffin of the Iron Mountain wouldn't be enough to stop him. And while Hanami's domain is largely an unknown entity in this discussion, their relativity to Jogo at best implies that they too wouldn't have attacks potent enough to take him down. Shoot, if Dagon traps him in his domain, it'll be the worst thing that he ever does, because the Son of Poseidon is making that squid's domain his new home, and giving Percy the little ocean break he needed to fight the rest of the verse at 120% of his full power. I could see characters like Maki and Toji having a few cool sword slashes with Percy, but even the pinnacle of pure physicality of the verse gets quickly overwhelmed by the Son of the Sea God. Of the entire Jujutsu Kaisen verse, I can honestly only see a handful of characters causing Percy trouble or outright stopping him. Sukuna and Gojo are on the list for obvious reasons, but outside of that, Mahito, Takaba, Mahoraga, Yuki, and maybe Hikari are all characters that, if not beating Percy, at least have the proper hacks to be addressed explicitly in this video. Mahito is tough because idle transfiguration makes him vulnerable to damage. Takaba and the comedian is a pain in the ass to deal with. Mahoraga's adaptation could be very tricky to go up against in a prolonged exchange. Yuki can blow up the planet and take you with it if you aren't careful. Yuta has amped up curse speech to halt Percy's movement, and Hikari would also be an annoying ass opponent solely because of his regeneration. For the entirety of this video, I've been gassing up Percy, and rightfully so, but one thing I'm not going to do is lie. Because let's just call a spade. If Percy can't physically overwhelm his opponents, he's not really going to beat them because he's just not smart enough to deal with a lot of the curse techniques that these characters have. It's not so much that Percy is dumb, but more that he isn't a super strategical genius like Sukun or Annabeth, and also comes from a verse with much simpler abilities that he has more background information on. Practically speaking, Percy wouldn't really need all that much intelligence against Yuki, Maharaga, and Hikari simply due to his ability to overwhelm them before they could retaliate. Yuki could still threaten to blow up the planet with her technique if she's beaten before landing any hits, but in that scenario, the conclusion of this match is simply that it's a draw. Maharaga's adaptation takes too much time to take place, and Percy would deal with him in a matter of moments anyway. Hikari, particularly in Jackpot, could be difficult for Percy to deal with due to the speed of his RCT, but we've seen Percy deal out a few head chopping attacks before, and in the worst case scenario, he simply weathers the storm for 4 minutes and cooks him in base. Yuda's Curse Speech is an ability that I thought could probably be effective against Percy, but in revisiting some material from the wider Riordan verse, specifically the Demigods and Magicians crossover, it seems that Percy is extremely resilient to all forms of magic, to the point that it even confuses a very experienced and talented magician in Carter Kane. Now, this magical resistance only counts for anything if you're applying cross-verse logic here, but this battle really only happens under weird circumstances anyway, and comparing magic to sorcery in this instance isn't that far off. Multiple times in the book series, particularly The Last Olympian, Percy has been shown to be able to resist magic, so Curse Speech, while definitely an attack option, definitely wouldn't be enough to stop him permanently. This leaves Mahito, Takaba, Sukuna, and Gojo, and they're ranked in ascending order of difficulty for Percy to deal with. Mahito is obviously an issue because of his soul invulnerability, and while I initially thought that there would be no arguments for Percy being able to damage Mahito and his soul, revisiting the story once more disproved that yet again. Not only has Percy survived cuts from blades that literally rip the soul from the body, but the very nature of his sword's material is stated to dissolve a demigod's essence from the inside out, with it obviously having a similar effect on monsters. The first feat demonstrates a resilience to soul-based attacks, meaning that Mahito will not be one-shotting him with Idol Transfiguration, and the second move gives some level of credence to Riptide, giving Percy the ability to harm characters beyond their conventional durability, much like Toji in Maki's Soul Split Katana or Maharaga's Sword of Extermination. If that statement is too ambiguous though, you can pull from his many trips to the underworld, in which it's made clear that Percy can not only perceive the souls of the dead with no corporeal form, but he even fights Hades' army, showing that he can combat things not limited to the physical. If this translates to hurting Mahito's soul like I think it implies, then Percy dices up the human curse and moves on with his day. If not, Percy gets trapped in a domain and loses to Mahito high diff. This just leaves Takaba, Gojo, and Sukuna, 3 characters that I really don't think Percy has any hope of winning against. The Comedian is just too niche of an ability for Percy to aptly respond to, leaving him the option of blitzing him before he gets a technique activated, or simply losing the war of attrition. Sukuna wins if you think that his light speed scaling is valid, simply because that would make him relative to Percy in speed, and he has multiple attacks that would be able to wear down the demigod. It's only if you think Percy is essentially a blitz level difference above Sukuna that he's able to secure a W. Once again, assuming the relativity, typical dismantle slices wouldn't work against Percy, or at least be enough to put him down, especially if he's still cloaked in the Curse of Achilles, but with Cleave adjusting to his durability, world-splitting slashes ignoring toughness altogether, a ceaseless domain expansion housing both types of attacks, and a fire arrow as the cherry on top, even Percy Jackson wouldn't be able to tank or avoid everything. And as for Gojo, he wins his fight against Percy for similar reasons that he wins a lot of his cross-verse battles. Infinity isn't getting bypassed, and Unlimited Void is too difficult to counter. Now, in the first round of this video, I left a particular character out of the individual discussions because, much like the rest of the verse, I think they get blitzed and cut through before doing anything of note, but I know that if I go this entire video without mentioning Higuruma Hiromi in some form or fashion, that's all y'all are going to be talking about down in the comment section. So, in regards to his scaling particularly, it's pretty obvious that Higuruma doesn't in any way, shape, or form match up to Percy. Lowballing both of them, Percy is dozens and dozens of times faster than he is. Highballing both of them leads to a very similar conclusion, and even when being as generous as possible to Higgy while downplaying Percy leads to the demigod still having a very confident speed advantage. So much so that I would argue Deadly Sentencing isn't even opened before he's cut in twain. He's able to land his domain on Sukuna largely in part because he allowed for it, but even assuming that Percy gets caught and Riptide gets stolen, I shit you not that Percy is so strong strong relative to Higuruma that his comparatively ass hand-to-hand combat skills would be enough to decimate him in seconds. While Percy is far from skilled with his hands and is damn near featless, at least from what we've seen, he's still the body behind Riptide and physically capable of blocking strikes from the mountain stacking giants I mentioned earlier, meaning that in the best case scenario for Higuruma, confiscation and death penalty alike, Percy is running up to him, dodging every slash, and sending the lawyer to Hades with a mean-ass uppercut. While Higuruma's hacks are quite potent and his talent rivals that of Gojo Satoru, he doesn't have the proper mix of curse technique and physical stats to stand to Poseidon's son and come out on top. At the end of it all, Percy isn't quite equipped with the moves to take on the entire Jujutsu Kaisen universe, but he certainly gets close, leaving only 3 characters alive after his first encounter with Jujutsu Society. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more versus battles like this, check out this playlist here and consider subscribing. And if you want more Percy Jackson content from me, you're in luck because I have a few more videos covering the series coming to the channel quite soon. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.